Hi everyone, welcome to Papertown. I hope you're all doing well. Tonight we're going to do something a little different. We're going to tell a story. Not one episode, not one season, but the whole thing. The entire story of South Park. From the very beginning, from a couple of college kids cutting up construction paper in Colorado, all the way to now. Because South Park isn't just a TV show. It's a living record of what it felt like to be alive in America for the last 3 decades. Every fear, every obsession, every moral panic, every political earthquake, it's all in there. Preserved in paper cutout form. And when you lay it all out, when you trace the line from 1997 to today, what emerges isn't just a timeline. It's a story, a real one, about 4 boys who never grew up, the town that never changed, and the country that couldn't stop changing around them. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. To understand where South Park came from, you have to go back before the show existed. Back to 1992, when 2 film students at the University of Colorado, named Trey Parker and Matt Stone, made a short animated film called The Spirit of Christmas. It was crude. It was made with actual construction paper, actual stop motion, actual scissors, and glue. And it featured 2 characters who would later become Stan and Kyle, watching Jesus fight Santa Claus over the true meaning of Christmas. The whole thing was about 4 minutes long. It was a holiday card, essentially. A joke. But something about it resonated. It got passed around. People copied it on VHS tapes and shared it with their friends. This was years before YouTube, years before viral videos were even a concept. But The Spirit of Christmas went viral in the most analog way possible. A few years later, in 1995, Fox executive Brian Graden paid Parker and Stone to make another version of the short, which they called The Spirit of Christmas. Jesus versus Santa. This one spread even further. It caught the attention of Comedy Central. And on August 13th, 1997, the first episode of South Park aired. It was called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. And nothing was ever quite the same. Now, I want to be honest about what those early episodes were. They were crude. They were shocking. They were designed, above all else, to be the thing that your parents didn't want you to watch. This was the late 90s. The culture wars were raging. There was genuine panic about the influence of television on children, about the coarsening of public discourse, about the death of decency. And into that environment came South Park, a show that featured 8-year-olds swearing, a talking piece of Christmas feces named Mr. Hanky, and a kid who died violently in every episode. It was, in every sense, a provocation. But here's the thing that people forget about those early seasons. Even then, even when the show was at its crudest, there was something else going on. Something smarter. Because the very first episode, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, isn't just about aliens abducting a fat kid. It's about the difference between experience and belief. Cartman has an alien satellite dish coming out of his rear end, and he refuses to believe what's happening to him. His friends can see it. The audience can see it. But Cartman insists that everything is normal, and that tension between observable reality and willful denial would become one of the show's central themes for the next 3 decades. The first season established the basic architecture. 4 boys. Stan Marsh, the normal one. Kyle Broflovsky, the Jewish one. Eric Cartman, the fat one. Kenny McCormick, the poor one. They lived in a small town in Colorado. They went to school. They had adventures that were simultaneously mundane and insane. And every week, one of them, usually Kyle, would deliver a little speech about what they'd learned. It was a parody of after-school specials, but it was also, somehow, sincere. Even when the show was making fun of moral lessons, it was also delivering them. Those first few seasons, roughly 1997 through 2001, were the shock era. The show was finding its voice, testing its limits, seeing how far it could push. And the context matters here. This was the late 90s. The Lewinsky scandal was dominating the news. Boy bands were dominating the charts. The internet was still a novelty for most people. And the prevailing cultural anxiety was about children, about what they were exposed to, about what they were absorbing from the media they consumed. And South Park, with its profanity and its violence and its absolute refusal to shield children from anything, was positioned as the worst nightmare of every concerned parent in America. The show leaned into this hard. The season 1 Christmas episode, Mr. Hanky the Christmas Pooh, introduced a sentient piece of feces as a beloved holiday character. It was designed to offend. It was designed to make parents clutch their pearls. And it worked. The controversy around South Park in those early years was enormous. Religious groups protested it. Parents' organizations condemned it. Schools banned students from wearing South Park merchandise. And the ratings went through the roof. Because there's nothing a teenager wants more than the thing they're not supposed to have. Season 2 expanded the world. It introduced Chef's parents, who told increasingly elaborate stories about the Loch Ness Monster asking them for $3.50. It gave us Terrence and Phillip, the Canadian comedy duo, whose entire act consisted of fart jokes, which served as both a satire of critics who reduced South Park to toilet humor and a deliberate provocation of those same critics. And it deepened the boys' characters in subtle ways. Stan's romantic anxiety around Wendy Testaberger, which manifested as him vomiting every time she spoke to him, was genuinely sweet beneath the grossness. Kyle's struggles with being the only Jewish kid in a town full of casual anti-Semitism were played for laughs, but rooted in something real. Season 3 introduced Tweak Tweak, the over-caffeinated kid whose parents owned a coffee shop and essentially kept him in a state of perpetual anxiety by feeding him espresso. It also gave us the Chin Pokemon episode, which satirized Pokemon and Japanese consumer culture with a sharpness that surprised people who thought the show was just about fart jokes. And it featured Rainforest Schmainforest, where the boys go on a field trip to Costa Rica with an environmental activist, played by Jennifer Aniston, and the rainforest turns out to be genuinely horrible. The episode was a preview of the show's emerging political identity. Neither left nor right, but suspicious of anyone who claimed to have all the answers. And throughout all of this, Chef was there. Jerome McElroy, the school cafeteria worker voiced by Isaac Hayes, was the boys' only reliable adult ally. He dispensed wisdom, usually in the form of songs about making love, and served as a bridge between the children's world and the adult world. Chef was kind. He was genuine. He cared about the boys in a way that most of the other adults in the show didn't. And his presence gave the early seasons a warmth that balanced the crudeness. Without Chef, South Park would have been all edge and no heart. With him, it was something more complex. But beneath the shock value, something else was happening. Something that wouldn't become fully apparent for years. The show was building a world, not just a setting, a world, with rules and history and geography and social structures. South Park the town had a school, South Park Elementary, with teachers and a principal and a cafeteria worker. It had a government, a mayor, a police force. It had geography, the mountains, and the forests, and the frozen landscape of a Colorado mountain town. It had a culture, an insular, suspicious, herd mentality culture that could turn on a dime from complacency to panic and back again. And most importantly, it had a social ecosystem. The relationships between the characters weren't random. They were specific and consistent. Stan and Kyle were best friends. Kyle and Cartman were enemies. Kenny was the outsider within the group, present but peripheral, heard but not understood. The adults were well-meaning but ineffective, prone to overreaction and moral panic, unable to protect the children from a world that was constantly, relentlessly strange. This ecosystem was established in the first season and has been maintained, with remarkable consistency, for nearly 30 years. And it's the reason the show has lasted. Because the jokes and the controversies come and go, but the ecosystem remains. the relationships remain. The fundamental dynamics remain. And as long as those dynamics are intact, the show has something to build on. And then there was the movie. South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, came out in June 1999. And it was a revelation. Not just because it was hilarious, which it was, but because it was a genuine musical. A real, full-throated, elaborately choreographed musical with songs that were good enough to earn an Academy Award nomination. Blame Canada, the song about parents blaming a foreign country for their children's behavior rather than examining their own parenting, was nominated for Best Original Song at the Oscars. And Parker and Stone showed up to the ceremony in dresses. Because of course they did. The movie was important for another reason too. It demonstrated that Parker and Stone could sustain a feature-length narrative, that they could build characters, develop themes, and create emotional payoffs over 90 minutes rather than 22. And the skills they developed making the movie would eventually transform the show itself. The movie also introduced a crucial piece of the show's mythology. Kenny went to hell, and in hell, he met Satan, who was in an abusive relationship with Saddam Hussein. It was absurd. It was hilarious. But it also established that in the South Park universe, the afterlife was real. It had rules, and those rules could be bent. This would become important later, when the show started exploring what happened to Kenny between his deaths. The movie planted the seed. The show would water it for more than a decade before it bloomed. But we'll get to that. First, let's talk about what happened in Season 4 and Season 5, because this is where the show started to become something more than a provocation. Season 4 is notable for several reasons. First, it introduced a slightly more polished animation style. The show had transitioned fully to digital production by this point, which meant episodes could be completed faster and with more visual complexity. But the creators deliberately maintained the crude, paper-cutout aesthetic that had defined the show from the beginning. This was a conscious choice. They could have made the show look slicker. They chose not to. And this decision has been maintained through every subsequent technological advancement. When other animated shows were upgrading their visuals, adopting 3D rendering, experimenting with hybrid techniques, South Park stayed flat, stayed crude, stayed deliberately primitive, because the primitiveness was honest. It said, we don't care about looking impressive, we care about what we're saying, because the crudeness was part of the message. It said, don't take this too seriously, but also, look closer. And there's something else about Season 4 that I think is significant for the show's larger story. This was the season where South Park's worldview started to crystallize. The episode Trapper Keeper depicted a presidential election between two kindergartners that perfectly mirrored the messiness of the 2000 Bush Gore election, which was still being contested when the episode aired. The wacky molestation adventure depicted the children of South Park banishing all adults from town and descending into a Lord of the Flies style society, a commentary on the generation gap that was both hilarious and slightly disturbing. And the season finale, 4th grade, dealt with the boys transitioning from 3rd grade to 4th grade and feeling the existential weight of change, even a small change, for the first time. These episodes shared a common thread. They were all, in different ways, about the gap between how the world appears and how it actually works, between the stories we tell ourselves and the reality underneath. And this gap, this persistent fascination with the difference between appearance and reality, would become the central preoccupation of the show for the next 2 decades. It's there in Cartman's manipulations, which depend on the gap between what he says and what he means. It's there in the political satire, which depends on the gap between what politicians promise and what they deliver. It's there in Kenny's immortality, which depends on the gap between what the characters perceive and what's actually happening. Season 4 also gave us some genuinely remarkable episodes. The Tooth Fairy Tats 2000, which featured Cartman having an existential crisis about the nature of reality after discovering the Tooth Fairy isn't real. Timmy 2000, which introduced Timmy Birch, a wheelchair-bound character with limited verbal ability, who became an instant fan favorite. and Cherokee hair tampons, where Kyle needs a kidney transplant and the boys discover that Cartman is the only compatible donor. It's a simple premise. Cartman has something Kyle needs and refuses to give it, but it explores the dynamic between them with a precision and an emotional depth that the earlier seasons hadn't achieved. Stan's desperation to save his best friend, Kyle's fear of mortality, Cartman's absolute refusal to sacrifice anything for anyone, all of it was there. All of it was real. Season 4, which aired in 2000, featured some of the show's most ambitious episodes to date. Probably the most important was the two-part Do the Handicapped Go to Hell and Probably, which depicted the boys becoming terrified of damnation and trying to get right with God. The episode featured Satan in a dysfunctional relationship with Saddam Hussein. It was absurd. It was offensive to approximately everyone. But it was also a genuine exploration of how children process the concept of eternal punishment, of how religious fear can distort young minds, of the gap between what faith promises and what faith demands. And then Season 5 arrived, and everything changed. Because Season 5 gave us Scott Tenorman Must Die. We've talked about this episode before on this channel, but it's worth repeating here, because in the context of the show's overall story, it's a turning point. Before Scott Tenorman Must Die, Cartman was annoying. After it, he was terrifying. The episode, which aired on July 11th, 2001, showed Cartman orchestrating the murder of a teenager's parents and feeding them to him as chili. It was the darkest thing the show had ever done, and it signaled that South Park was no longer content to be merely outrageous. It wanted to be unsettling. It wanted to create moments that stayed with you, that you couldn't quite shake. Season 5 also introduced the Cripple Fight episode, which featured a lengthy brawl between Jimmy and Timmy, two disabled characters who had become regular cast members. It sounds offensive when you describe it, and it was, but it was also radical in its own way, because the show treated Jimmy and Timmy as fully realized characters, not as objects of pity. They were funny. They were flawed. They were capable of pettiness and violence and everything else that the able-bodied characters were capable of. In a cultural landscape where disabled characters were usually saintly or invisible, South Park's approach was, paradoxically, more respectful than most, because it refused to treat disability as the most important thing about a person. And then there was Kenny Dies, the episode where Kenny's death was treated not as a joke, but as a genuine tragedy. Kenny developed a terminal illness. His friends visited him in the hospital. Stan couldn't bring himself to say goodbye. And when Kenny finally passed, his last words were asking where Stan was. It was heartbreaking. And it was also a creative gamble, because Parker and Stone actually removed Kenny from the show for the entirety of Season 6. The character that had died in almost every episode was now genuinely gone. And let me spend a moment on what that absence felt like. Because Kenny Dies wasn't just a creative experiment. It was a genuine emotional event. For 5 seasons, Kenny had died as a joke, over and over and over. And the audience had been trained to laugh at it, to expect it, to treat it as background noise. And then, suddenly, his death was real. It was permanent. And the comedy of it evaporated, and what was left underneath was grief. I think that's one of the most remarkable things the show has ever done. Training an audience to laugh at something for 5 years, and then making them cry about it. It's a magic trick, really. A sleight of hand. You think the running gag is the point, but the point was always the emotion underneath the gag, waiting to be revealed when the gag was taken away. And the absence was felt, not just narratively, but tonally. Season 6 without Kenny was a different show. Quieter, in some ways. Less chaotic. The 3 remaining boys had to reorganize their dynamic. Stan and Kyle drew closer together. Cartman had to find new targets for his cruelty. And the void that Kenny left was palpable. It proved that he hadn't been peripheral at all. He'd been essential. The group needed 4 members. 3 wasn't enough. Season 6, which aired in 2002, is one of the most interesting seasons in the show's history precisely because of Kenny's absence. The boys spent the season trying to find a replacement. Butters Stotch, who had been a background character, was promoted to the main group. He was naive, innocent, eager to please, and hopelessly out of his depth. He lasted a few episodes before the boys decided he wasn't cool enough. Then they tried Tweek. Same result. And eventually, by the end of the season, Kenny returned in the Christmas episode Red Sleigh Down, and the show went back to its original configuration. Season 6 also featured some genuinely excellent individual episodes. The return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers, where the boys embark on a Lord of the Rings style quest to return a VHS tape, only for the tape to turn out to be a pornographic film, is a masterpiece of structure and tone. It works as a parody of Tolkien. It works as a commentary on children's exposure to adult content. And it works as a pure comedy, with Butters becoming gradually corrupted by the tape in the same way Gollum is corrupted by the ring. The episode demonstrates that even in a season of transition, the show's ability to create perfectly structured comedic narratives was undiminished. And then there was the season 6 finale, Red Sleigh Down, where Kenny returned. Santa Claus goes to deliver presents to a rock and is captured by insurgents. The boys mount a rescue mission, and Kenny, who had been absent for 17 episodes, simply appears. No fanfare, no explanation. He's just there, as if he never left. And the show treats this as perfectly normal. Because in South Park, it is perfectly normal. Death is temporary. Absence is temporary. The status quo always reasserts itself. Nobody questions it. Nobody asks where Kenny was. Nobody acknowledges that anything unusual has happened. It's as if he never left. And there's something beautiful about that, and something terrible. Beautiful because it means the group is whole again. Terrible because it means Kenny's absence, which had been so acutely felt by the audience for 17 episodes, meant nothing to the characters. They hadn't learned to value him more. They hadn't been changed by his loss. They just went on. And Kenny slipped back into his place, as if it had been waiting for him all along. This is, I think, one of the show's most profound statements about friendship and loss and memory. We like to believe that when someone disappears from our lives, we hold a space for them, that their absence changes us, that when they return, things will be different. But the truth, the uncomfortable truth, is that people adapt. They fill the gap. They move on. And when the lost person returns, the world they return to has already closed the wound. The scar is there, maybe, but the pain is gone. And that's a harder thing to face than the loss itself. But the Kenny who returned was different from the Kenny who had left. Not visibly. Not in terms of his design, or his voice, or his place in the group, but in terms of the weight he carried. The audience knew, after Kenny dies, that his deaths meant something, that they had consequences, even if those consequences were invisible. And from season 7 onward, Kenny's character existed in a strange dual state. He was the same kid he'd always been, but the audience's relationship with him had fundamentally changed. But Kenny's absence had lasting consequences. It forced the show to develop its supporting cast. Butters, who might have remained a minor character forever, became one of the most important figures in the show's history. His innocence, his vulnerability, his willingness to be used and abused by Cartman created a dynamic that the show would return to again and again for the next 2 decades. Kenny's death created Butters, and Butters, in many ways, became the show's conscience. And I think it's important to understand what Butters brought to the show that the original 4 boys couldn't provide. Because Butters isn't just a replacement for Kenny. He's a different kind of character entirely. Kenny was silent, mysterious, concealed behind his hood. Butters is open, transparent, heart on his sleeve. Kenny was tough, resilient, surviving death after death with mute stoicism. Butters is fragile, vulnerable, wounded by every slight and every betrayal. And where Kenny's suffering was hidden, Butters' suffering is the most visible thing about him. Butters' home life, which the show developed gradually over subsequent seasons, became one of its most disturbing running threads. His parents, Stephen and Linda Stotch, were abusive in ways that were sometimes played for comedy and sometimes played for genuine discomfort. Stephen grounded Butters for everything. Linda tried to drown him. They sent him to a conversion therapy camp. They sold him into slavery on one occasion. And through all of it, Butters remained loyal to them. He loved his parents despite everything they did to him. He defended them. He made excuses for them. And the show, while using this dynamic for humor, never entirely disguised the horror underneath. This is one of the things that makes South Park so unusual among comedies. It's willing to show genuine darkness. Not shock darkness, not the cartoon violence of Kenny's deaths, but real psychological darkness. The kind of darkness that exists in real families, behind closed doors, where children absorb abuse and call it normal because they don't know anything else. Butters' arc is, underneath the jokes, a story about the long-term effects of parental abuse on a child's development. And the fact that the show tells this story while also making you laugh is a testament to its remarkable tonal control. The show would eventually give Butters his own mythology, making him the supervillain Professor Chaos, a persona that Butters adopts because the constant mistreatment by his friends and family has pushed him to the breaking point. Professor Chaos is Butters' attempt to take control of a world that has given him none. And like everything else in South Park, it works on multiple levels simultaneously. It's a parody of supervillain origin stories. It's a commentary on how society creates its own enemies. And it's a genuinely sympathetic portrait of a boy who's been pushed too far. Now, I want to pause here and talk about something that was happening behind the scenes during this period. Because the real-world context of the early 2000s shaped the show in ways that weren't always visible on screen. September 11th, 2001 happened between seasons 5 and 6. The world changed overnight. America went to war. The national mood shifted from the complacency of the late 90s to the anxiety of the early 2000s. And South Park, which had always been responsive to its cultural moment, had to figure out how to be funny in a world that suddenly felt unfunny. The show's first direct reference to the attacks came in the season 6 episode Jared Has AIDS, which aired in March 2002. But the show's broader engagement with the post-9/11 world played out more subtly, through a gradual darkening of its worldview. The show had always been cynical about authority, but post-9/11 South Park was cynical about everything. About patriotism, about fear, about the way crisis was used to justify the erosion of civil liberties, about the way good intentions could be weaponized. The show's response was characteristically audacious. Rather than avoiding the topic, Parker and Stone leaned into it. Not immediately, and not without care, but deliberately. The season 7 episode, I'm a Little Bit Country, depicted the town of South Park divided over the Iraq War, with one side waving flags and the other protesting. And the conclusion was quintessentially South Park. The pro-war and anti-war factions both turned out to be necessary. America needed both the people willing to fight and the people willing to question the fighting. The two sides weren't opposed. They were complementary. It was a nuanced take on a polarized debate, delivered by a show that most people still thought of as juvenile. And this is where the show's identity really crystallized. Because the Iraq War era forced South Park to take positions on issues that couldn't be resolved with a joke. And the positions it took, consistently skeptical of authority, consistently suspicious of certainty, consistently insistent that the truth was complicated, established a political identity that the show would maintain for the next 2 decades. The mid-2000s, roughly seasons 7 through 10, represent what I think of as the show's maturation period. This is when South Park stopped being primarily about shock and started being primarily about satire. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, episode by episode, season by season. But by the time you get to season 8, the show's focus has clearly changed. It's less interested in grossing you out and more interested in making you think. And this shift was driven by something very human. Parker and Stone were growing up. When the show started, they were in their late 20s. Rebels, provocateurs, outsiders who had stumbled into mainstream success and were determined to blow it up from the inside. But by the mid-2000s, they were in their mid-30s. They had homes and relationships and responsibilities. The world looked different to them than it had in 1997. And the show evolved to reflect their changing perspective. You can see this most clearly in how the show started treating its adult characters. In the early seasons, the adults were either villains or idiots. Mr. Garrison was a closeted mess. Mr. Mackey was a walking catchphrase. Principal Victoria was a bureaucrat. The parents were clueless enablers. But starting around season 7 or 8, the adults began to develop inner lives. Randy's episodes started exploring his dissatisfaction, his yearning for excitement, his fear of irrelevance. Gerald Broflovsky's episodes started exploring his self-righteousness, his hypocrisy, his need to be seen as a good person. Sharon Marsh became the voice of sanity in a household of chaos, a woman trying to hold her family together while her husband lost his mind on a weekly basis. These weren't just comedy characters anymore. They were people. Complex, contradictory, recognizably human people. And the show's willingness to develop them, to give them depth and nuance and genuine emotional lives, is one of the things that separates South Park from its imitators. Other shows could be offensive. Other shows could be topical. But few other shows could create characters who were simultaneously absurd and authentic. Season 7 gave us the Casa Bonita episode, one of the most beloved in the show's history, where Cartman goes to insane lengths to attend Kyle's birthday party at Casa Bonita, a real restaurant in Denver. The episode is hilarious, but it's also a masterclass in character work. Cartman's desperation to be included, his willingness to kidnap and gaslight Butters, his genuine joy when he finally gets to Casa Bonita, all of it reveals something about who he is beneath the cruelty. He wants to belong. He wants to have fun with his friends. He just doesn't know how to do it without destroying everything around him. Season 7 also gave us Raisins, where Wendy breaks up with Stan and he spirals into depression, joining the goth kids and wearing all black and listening to sad music. It's played for comedy, but Stan's pain is real. And the episode's resolution, where Butters delivers one of the show's most memorable speeches about how being sad is better than feeling nothing because it means you're alive, is genuinely moving. Butters, the naive, abused, overlooked kid, turns out to have more emotional wisdom than any other character in the show. And that's not an accident. That's character development. Careful, deliberate character development that has been maintained across decades. And I want to talk about the show's relationship with video games during this period, because it became an increasingly important part of the South Park story. The first South Park video game was released in 1998, and it was terrible. But the franchise's gaming ambitions grew alongside the show. In 2014, South Park: The Stick of Truth was released, developed by Obsidian Entertainment with heavy involvement from Parker and Stone. The game was a genuine RPG that looked and played like an interactive episode of the show. And it was excellent. It told a story about the boys playing a fantasy game that gradually escalated into a real adventure, blending the show's humor with actual gameplay depth. The Stick of Truth was followed in 2017 by South Park: The Fractured But Whole, which put the boys in superhero costumes and featured the Coon and Friends characters. Both games were significant because they allowed Parker and Stone to tell South Park stories in a new medium, at a new pace, with a new kind of audience engagement. And they proved that the South Park universe was robust enough to support extended narratives in multiple formats. The games also fed back into the show. The Black Friday trilogy in Season 17 was directly connected to the Stick of Truth, with the Boys Console War serving as both a Game of Thrones parody and a promotion for the game. And the superhero mythology that drove the Fractured But Whole had its roots in the Coon and Friends episodes from Season 14. The show and the games were in conversation with each other, each enriching the other. Season 8, which aired in 2004, is a good example. The season premiere, Good Times with Weapons, featured the boys buying martial arts weapons at a flea swap and imagining themselves as anime characters. It was a visually inventive episode that played with the contrast between the show's crude animation and the elaborate anime sequences in the boys' imagination. But it was also an episode about the disconnect between fantasy and reality, about how easily children can become dangerous when they have access to real weapons. Season 9 brought one of the show's most controversial and culturally significant episodes. Trapped in the Closet. The episode depicted Scientology's beliefs, including the story of Xenu and the alien souls called Thetans, with a text at the bottom of the screen that read, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." Tom Cruise, depicted in the episode as literally refusing to come out of a closet, was furious, and the fallout was enormous. The episode led directly to Isaac Hayes, who had voiced Chef since the beginning and who was himself a Scientologist, leaving the show. The aftermath of the episode was messy and public. Hayes released a statement criticizing the show for religious intolerance. Parker and Stone responded by pointing out that Hayes had been perfectly fine with the show mocking every other religion for 9 years and only objected when his own faith was the target. It was a public falling out between people who had worked together for nearly a decade. And what made it particularly painful was that Hayes hadn't just been a voice actor. He was a legend, a Grammy winner, a Shaft theme composer, a rock and roll Hall of Famer. His involvement in the show from the very beginning had given South Park a credibility that it might not otherwise have had. When Isaac Hayes was willing to be part of your show, it meant your show had something going for it. And when he left, the loss was both creative and symbolic. There's been debate over the years about whether Hayes left voluntarily or whether his departure was orchestrated by Scientology leadership. Some of his associates have claimed that by the time he left the show, Hayes was in declining health, and that the statement criticizing South Park may not have been his own words. We may never know the full truth. But what we do know is that the show lost one of its most important characters and one of its most important performers. And it handled that loss the only way it knew how, by turning it into comedy, by making it part of the story. And it underscored one of the show's central themes. Everyone supports free speech until their own sacred cows are on the chopping block. The show's response to Hayes' departure was Season 10's premiere, The Return of Chef. In it, Chef returns to South Park having been brainwashed by a group called the Super Adventure Club. The boys try to save him. They fail. Chef dies, horribly, falling off a bridge, being impaled, mauled by a bear and a mountain lion, and his face being torn off. It was brutal. It was vengeful. And it was also, at its core, sad, because the boys' grief was real. Kyle's speech at Chef's funeral, where he said they shouldn't be mad at Chef because it wasn't really him who had gone crazy. It was that fruity little club that scrambled his brains, was a transparent commentary on Hayes' departure, and it was delivered with genuine emotion. Chef's death marked the end of an era. The boys had lost their most reliable adult ally. The show had lost one of its warmest, most beloved characters, and the gap that Chef left was never really filled. It couldn't be, because Chef wasn't just a character. He was a tone, a warmth, a connection between the show's cruelty and its kindness. And when he was gone, the show became a little colder, a little sharper, which was, in many ways, appropriate for the years that followed. And then there was the Imagination Land trilogy in Season 11. 3 episodes, airing in October 2007, that depicted the boys entering a realm where every character ever imagined by humanity existed. It was the show's most ambitious narrative to date. It was epic in scale, featuring hundreds of fictional characters in a battle between good and evil imagination. It won an Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program, and it demonstrated that South Park could tell stories that were genuinely grand, that operated on a scale beyond the small-town satire that had been the show's bread and butter. I should mention that around this same period, the show also produced some of its finest character-driven episodes. Season 8's Awesome O, where Cartman disguises himself as a robot to spy on Butters, is a perfect encapsulation of their dynamic. Cartman's cruelty, Butters' innocence, and the way the power dynamic gradually inverts as Butters inadvertently gains the upper hand. Season 9's Best Friends Forever, which dealt with the Terry Schiavo case through the lens of Kenny's death, won a Peabody Award for its nuanced handling of a deeply divisive real-world issue. And Season 9 also gave us The Losing Edge, where the boys try to lose at baseball because they don't want to keep playing through summer, and Randy becomes increasingly violent at the games, picking fights with other parents. It was one of the first episodes to center Randy's storyline over the boys, a sign of things to come. And there was the Season 10 episode Make Love, Not Warcraft, which depicted the boys becoming obsessed with World of Warcraft to defeat a rogue player who was killing everyone in the game. The episode, made in collaboration with Blizzard Entertainment, featured extended sequences rendered in the actual game engine. It was a technical achievement, a loving parody of gaming culture, and a commentary on addiction and obsession, all wrapped in one of the funniest episodes the show ever produced. It also won an Emmy, adding to the growing pile of critical recognition that South Park was accumulating almost in spite of its reputation. By the end of Season 11, the show had established itself as something that couldn't be dismissed anymore. Whatever people thought about its crudeness, whatever discomfort they felt about its willingness to offend, the quality of the writing, the sophistication of the satire, and the depth of the characters could no longer be denied. South Park had earned its place in the conversation about great American television, not alongside the prestige dramas necessarily, but alongside them in importance, as a different kind of great, a messier, louder, more democratic kind of great that didn't require an HBO subscription or a tolerance for slow pacing. It was popular art that was also genuinely artful. And then there was the two-part Cartoon Wars in Season 10, which directly addressed the controversy over depicting the Prophet Muhammad in cartoons. This was 2006, a year after the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten had published cartoons that sparked worldwide protests. South Park waded directly into the controversy, creating an episode in which Family Guy was going to show Muhammad, and various factions tried to stop it. Comedy Central ultimately censored the depiction, replacing Muhammad with a black bar and a title card. And South Park incorporated that censorship into the episode itself, making the network's cowardice part of the show's commentary. The Cartoon Wars episodes were also significant because they engaged directly with South Park's main competitor in adult animation, Family Guy. The episodes depicted the Family Guy writing process as literally random, with manatees pushing idea balls into a machine that generated cutaway gags. It was a vicious, specific critique. And while it certainly reflected a genuine creative rivalry, it also served a larger purpose. It articulated what South Park was not. By defining Family Guy as random, disconnected, relying on shock without substance, the episodes implicitly defined South Park as the opposite, as deliberate, as connected, as shock with substance. It was the show's own declaration of artistic intent, disguised as a feud. This was a watershed moment. It showed that South Park wasn't just willing to be offensive in general terms. It was willing to challenge specific, powerful institutions and face real consequences. The show was censored. Cartoon Wars depicted the consequences of that censorship. And then, in Season 14, the show returned to the Muhammad controversy with episodes 200 and 201, which were even more heavily censored. Entire speeches were bleeped. Kyle's closing monologue about intimidation was completely obscured, and the show received genuine death threats from extremist groups. This wasn't theoretical controversy. This was real danger. real censorship, real intimidation. And the show kept going. This was the moment when South Park fully became what it would remain for the next 20 years. A show that didn't just comment on the news. A show that made itself part of the news. That used its platform not just to entertain, but to provoke genuine public discourse about censorship, free speech, religious sensitivity, and the limits of satire. The 2008 election brought one of the show's most impressive technical achievements. About Last Night, the episode responding to Barack Obama's presidential victory, aired on November 5, 2008, just one day after the election. Parker and Stone had prepared two versions of the episode, one for an Obama win and one for a McCain win, and finished the final version in the hours after the results came in. The episode depicted Obama and McCain's campaigns as an elaborate heist, an Ocean's 11-style caper to steal the Hope Diamond, in which the two candidates were secretly working together. It was a brilliant satirical conceit, and it demonstrated the show's production process at its most extraordinary. No other show on television could have responded to a real-world event with that kind of speed and creativity. Between the political satire, the show continued to develop its characters and its world. Season 13's Margaritaville, which won the Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program, depicted the economic recession as a religious experience, with the townspeople treating the economy as an angry god that needed to be appeased through sacrifice and self-denial. It was a devastating critique of the way Americans understand, or fail to understand, economics. The Randy subplot, in which he treats the economy like a wrathful deity, featured him decapitating a chicken as a sacrificial offering to the economic gods. It was absurd, and it was perfect, because it captured the genuine irrationality of the way ordinary people respond to economic crisis. The panic buying, the ritual belt-tightening, the magical thinking that if we just suffer enough, prosperity will return. The episode argued that Americans' relationship with their economy was fundamentally religious, based on faith rather than understanding, on fear rather than knowledge. And it was structured like a biblical parable, complete with a Messiah figure in Kyle who pays off the town's debts with a credit card. The episode worked on multiple levels simultaneously, as comedy, as satire, as genuine economic commentary, and as a character study of Kyle's messianic tendencies. And then there was the season 14 premiere, Sexual Healing, which addressed the Tiger Woods scandal and the idea that sexual addiction was a disease. The show's take was characteristically skeptical. It argued that calling bad behavior a disease was just another way of avoiding responsibility. And it introduced a conspiracy theory involving the aliens from the very first episode, connecting the show's present to its past in one of those subtle callbacks that reward attentive viewers. And alongside all of this cultural commentary, the characters were quietly evolving. Stan, who had started as the generic everyman, was developing a streak of melancholy, a tendency toward disillusionment. You could see it building across the seasons. The way he would sometimes stand apart from his friends, looking at the world with a weariness that didn't quite fit an 8-year-old. Parker and Stone, who were themselves growing older and more disillusioned, were unconsciously projecting their own emotional state onto their most autobiographical character. And alongside the political satire, the show was building another thread that would become increasingly important: the thread of Kenny's secret. Because while all of this was happening, while the show was grappling with censorship and elections and cultural warfare, it was also quietly developing the mythology of Kenny McCormick. In Season 14, the Coon Trilogy, Coon 2 Hindsight, Mysterion Rises, and Coon Versus, Coon and Friends revealed that Kenny's deaths weren't a running gag. They were real. Kenny was genuinely immortal, connected to Lovecraftian cosmic forces through his parents' involvement with the cult of Cthulhu. He died. He was reborn. He remembered everything, and nobody else did. This revelation, dropped almost casually into a superhero parody, retroactively transformed 13 years of comedy into 13 years of horror. Every time we'd laughed at Kenny's death, he'd been suffering. Every time the show had reset to normal the next week, Kenny had been carrying the memory of what happened to him. It was a stunning recontextualization, and it demonstrated that even while the show was focused on topical satire, it was also tending to its deeper mythological gardens, growing things that wouldn't bloom for years. Between seasons 12 and 14, the show also produced some of its most enduring standalone episodes. The season 12 premiere, Tonsil Trouble, in which Cartman accidentally contracts H5 and deliberately infects Kyle. The season 13 episode Fish Sticks, which skewered Kanye West's inability to understand a simple joke. And the season 12 episode Breast Cancer Show Ever, where Wendy Testaberger finally beats Cartman in a fistfight, an episode that fans had been waiting years for, and that delivered one of the most satisfying payoffs in the show's history. Each of these episodes worked as individual stories, but together they formed part of a larger pattern. A pattern of the show deepening its characters while sharpening its satire, of becoming simultaneously more funny and more meaningful. It was a rare achievement. Most shows either get funnier or get deeper as they age. South Park was doing both. And I want to mention something else about this period that I think is important for understanding the show's full story: the way it handled Tweek and Craig. In the season 19 episode, Tweek x Craig, the boys are paired together as a romantic couple after Asian girls in the school draw yaoi fan art depicting them in a relationship. The episode is initially about the absurdity of the situation. Neither Tweek nor Craig seems to understand what's happening. They're being forced into a relationship by fan culture. But then, something unexpected happens. The show plays it straight. The episode ends with Tweek and Craig actually becoming a couple. And in subsequent seasons, their relationship is treated not as a joke, but as a genuine, healthy, loving partnership. This is remarkable for several reasons. First, because it emerged from a satirical premise and became something sincere. Second, because the show treated a same-sex relationship between children with more warmth and respect than many shows treat adult relationships. And third, because it demonstrated the show's capacity for growth. South Park in 1997 would not have handled this the same way. The show's relationship with LGBTQ themes evolved over 2 decades, from crude jokes to genuine empathy, and the Tweek-Craig relationship was the clearest expression of that evolution. In the post-COVID specials, they're still together as adults. The joke became canon. The satire became love. This culminated in what I consider one of the most important episodes in the show's history. You're Getting Old, the 7th episode of season 15, which aired in 2011. In this episode, Stan turns 10, and on his birthday, something breaks inside him. He starts perceiving everything as literally awful. Music sounds terrible. Movies look terrible. His friends seem shallow, and his parents seem broken. The world loses its color. And by the end of the episode, Stan's parents are separating. His friends have abandoned him, and he's walking alone through a gray, joyless world. It was devastating, and it was clearly personal. Parker was going through his own period of creative exhaustion and personal upheaval at the time, and he poured all of it into Stan. The episode wasn't really about a cartoon boy turning 10. It was about what it feels like when the things you used to love stop bringing you joy. When the music you grew up with sounds like noise. When the friends you've known your whole life seem like strangers. When the comfortable patterns of your daily existence start to feel like a prison. And the timing was significant. 2011 was a strange year in American culture. The financial crisis was still reverberating. Occupy Wall Street was gaining momentum. Social media was beginning to reshape how people communicated and formed identities. There was a pervasive sense that the old world was ending and nobody knew what the new one would look like. And Stan's cynicism, his inability to find joy in anything, his sense that everything was broken beyond repair, captured that cultural moment with eerie precision. The Asperger's follow-up introduced a dark wrinkle. Stan discovered that he could cure his cynicism by drinking alcohol. When he was drunk, the world looked normal again. The music sounded good. His friends were fun. Everything was fine. But only as long as he kept drinking. The episode ended with Stan secretly sipping from a flask, maintaining the appearance of normalcy through chemical dependency. And the show played this not for laughs, but for tragedy. It was a portrait of functional depression, of the way people learn to mask their pain rather than address it, of the quiet desperation that hides behind a smile. When the familiar becomes unbearable, when growing up doesn't mean gaining wisdom, but losing wonder. The follow-up episode, Asperger's, pulled things back from the brink. The status quo was restored, more or less. But something had changed. The show had shown its cards. It had admitted that beneath the jokes and the satire and the outrageous scenarios, there was something vulnerable, something that could break, and that vulnerability gave everything that came after a different weight. Seasons 12 through 17 also saw the rise of some of the show's most memorable recurring storylines. The season 12 episode About Last Night aired the day after the 2008 presidential election and depicted Obama's victory as part of an elaborate Ocean's 11 style heist. It was a masterclass in the show's rapid response production model. Written and animated in the days immediately surrounding the election, it captured the cultural moment with an immediacy that no other show could match. Season 13 brought The Ring, an episode about the Jonas Brothers and purity rings that was really about the commodification of teenage sexuality by the Disney Corporation. It was one of the show's sharpest media critiques, arguing that the packaging of innocence was itself a form of exploitation. And it featured Kenny, who was trying to get to third base with his girlfriend, in a rare starring role that showcased his personality beyond the running death gag. Season 14's 200th and 201st episodes brought back Scott to Norman and delivered the devastating reveal that Cartman had murdered his own father. We talked about this in a different video, but in the context of the show's overall story, what matters is the audacity. The willingness to reach back 9 seasons and pull a thread that changed everything we thought we knew about one of the show's most iconic episodes. It was retroactive storytelling at its finest, and it proved that even in a show with no formal continuity, the past was always present. And then there was the Black Friday trilogy in season 17. 3 episodes, Black Friday, A Song of Ass and Fire, and Titties and Dragons, that parodied Game of Thrones while satirizing consumer culture and the console wars between PlayStation and Xbox. The trilogy featured Kenny as Princess Kenny, dressed in full anime-inspired drag, betraying his friends for the PlayStation faction. It was funny, and elaborate, and surprisingly epic. And it demonstrated that the show could handle multi-episode storytelling with grace and ambition. By the end of season 17, which aired its finale on December 11th, 2013, South Park had been on the air for 16 years. It had produced 247 episodes. It had survived the departure of a core cast member, weathered genuine death threats, pioneered a production model that was equal parts genius and masochism, and evolved from a shock comedy into one of the most sophisticated, satirical voices on television. And it was about to reinvent itself again. Now, let's talk about what happened next. Because the next phase of South Park's evolution is, in many ways, the most dramatic. And it begins with Season 18. Season 18 premiered on September 24th, 2014. And from the very first episode, something was different. Plots carried over from one episode to the next. Details established in the premiere had consequences in later episodes. Randy Marsh's secret identity as the pop star Lord, which was introduced early in the season, became a running subplot that affected multiple episodes. The show was experimenting with continuity, and there was more to Season 18 than just the Lord arc. The premiere, Go Fund Yourself, featured the boys starting a company using the Washington Redskins name after the NFL team abandoned it. The episode connected to the ongoing debate about Native American mascots and trademark law. and it set the tone for a season that was more interested in systemic issues than individual absurdities. The season also featured Cock Magic, a hilarious episode about underground rooster-based magic, the Gathering tournaments, and Grounded Vindaloop, a remarkably inventive episode about virtual reality that played with layers of simulated reality in a way that would have made Philip K. Dick proud. But the real significance of Season 18 was structural. For the first time, viewers noticed that what happened in one episode affected the next. Stan's comment about Lord in one episode had consequences several episodes later. The town's economy was affected by decisions made in earlier installments. Characters referenced events from previous weeks. It was subtle, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it, but it changed the experience of watching the show fundamentally. This might not sound like a big deal. Most modern television shows have continuity. But for South Park, which had operated on an episodic reset button model for 17 years, it was revolutionary. It was the show reinventing itself, acknowledging that the old model, where nothing that happened one week mattered the next, was no longer sufficient. And there was a thematic logic to the Lord storyline that connected to the show's larger evolution. Randy, a middle-aged man pretending to be a teenage pop star, was essentially doing what the show itself was doing. Pretending to be young. Pretending to still be relevant to a demographic that had moved on. And the show was aware of this parallel. It was commenting on its own situation through Randy's disguise. The question the Lord storyline raised: can you be something you're not? Can you maintain an identity that doesn't belong to you? Was the question the show was asking about itself. Can South Park, a show that started as a voice of youthful rebellion, continue to matter in a world that has moved past rebellion? The answer, it turned out, was yes. But only by changing. Only by evolving. And Season 19 went even further. Premiering on September 16th, 2015, it was the first fully serialized season of South Park. Every episode connected to every other episode. There was a single, continuous narrative about the gentrification of South Park, the arrival of PC Principal, and the conflict between political correctness and the town's traditional way of life. It was ambitious. It was divisive. And it was, in many ways, the logical conclusion of everything the show had been building toward. The PC Principal character, introduced in the season premiere, was a fascinating creation. He was a fraternity bro type who had absorbed the language of social justice and used it aggressively, policing everyone's speech while remaining essentially thuggish in his methods. He was a satire of a specific cultural moment, the mid-2000s explosion of campus activism and online call-out culture. But what made the character interesting was that the show didn't simply dismiss him. By the end of the season, PC Principal had become a permanent fixture of the show. His impulses, the desire for fairness, the insistence on inclusive language, were shown to have some validity, even as his methods were mocked. It was the show doing what it did best, acknowledging the complexity of an issue that most people preferred to reduce to simple binaries. The season's arc also introduced the concept of gentrification to South Park, with a Whole Foods store opening in town and a character called Reality trying to make the residents confront uncomfortable truths about privilege and progress. And the season finale introduced Leslie, a character who turned out to be a sentient advertisement, a literal, living commercial designed to manipulate people's desires. It was a science fiction twist that connected the season's themes about authenticity and manipulation in a way that was both absurd and thematically coherent. Because here's what I think happened. Over the course of 18 seasons, Parker and Stone had built a world that was too complex, too detailed, too full of interconnected characters and storylines to be contained by the episodic format. The characters had grown too much. The relationships had become too nuanced. The world had accumulated too much history. Serialization wasn't just a creative choice. It was an inevitability. The show had outgrown its own format. And there's a parallel here to the Book of Mormon, the Broadway musical that Parker and Stone created with Robert Lopez, which opened in 2011. The musical, which won 9 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, proved that Parker and Stone could operate at the highest level of American entertainment. It was funny, of course. It was irreverent. It pushed boundaries. But it was also technically brilliant, emotionally engaging, and thematically complex. The skills that Parker and Stone had honed over 15 seasons of South Park, the ability to balance comedy and sincerity, the ability to satirize without dismissing, the ability to create characters who were simultaneously ridiculous and human. All of those skills reached their fullest expression in the Book of Mormon. And the success of the musical fed back into the show. Parker and Stone returned from Broadway with renewed creative energy and a broadened sense of what their storytelling could achieve. The ambition of seasons 18 and 19, the willingness to try serialization, the confidence to sustain a single narrative across an entire season, all of this came from the experience of creating a 3-hour musical that had to work as a single, unified piece. Broadway taught them long-form storytelling, and they brought that knowledge back to South Park. And then season 20 happened, and it almost broke the show. Season 20 aired in the fall of 2016. The entire season was built around 3 interconnected storylines. The first was about internet trolling, with Gerald Broflovsky, Kyle's father, secretly operating as an online troll named Skankhunt42. The second was about nostalgia, embodied by the member berries, sentient fruits that spoke in remember when statements and represented the seductive danger of longing for the past. And the third was about the presidential election, with Mr. Garrison running as a Donald Trump proxy. The season was the most ambitious thing the show had ever attempted, and it ran straight into a wall, because Parker and Stone had assumed that Hillary Clinton would win the election. They'd written their season around that assumption. And when Trump won instead, they had to scramble. Episodes had to be rewritten overnight. Plot threads had to be reworked. And the resulting season was, by most accounts, uneven, rushed in places, confused in others. The serialization that had worked so well in season 19 became a trap in season 20, because the interconnected narrative couldn't pivot fast enough to accommodate the real-world surprise. The Garrison as Trump storyline was perhaps the most consequential creative decision the show made during this period. In earlier seasons, Mr. Garrison had been many things: a closeted gay man, a transgender woman, a confused and angry person struggling with his own identity. But in season 19, the show transformed him into a Trump proxy, a character who ran for president on a platform of building a wall and being as offensive as possible. The joke, originally, was that Garrison would lose, that the show was satirizing the absurdity of a candidate who seemed to be trying to lose. But then, reality outpaced satire. Trump won, and Garrison was stuck as president for 4 seasons. This forced the show into an uncomfortable position. They had to maintain a storyline that was supposed to be temporary. They had to comment on a presidency they hadn't anticipated, using a character who was designed as a disposable joke. And the results were mixed. Some episodes in the Garrison presidency era were brilliant. Others felt forced. The show was trapped by its own satirical ambition, committed to a bit that reality had made unfunny. But even this struggle was instructive. It showed the limits of South Park's real-time satirical model. The show worked best when it could respond to events with the distance of comedy. When the events were too large, too overwhelming, too genuinely destabilizing, the comedy couldn't quite contain them. And that's honestly one of the most interesting things about this period, because most shows, when they stumble, try to hide it. They pretend the bad season was intentional. They retcon the failures. They spin the narrative to make themselves look good. But South Park doesn't do that. South Park wears its failures openly. The unevenness of season 20 isn't a secret. It's part of the show's story. It's a chapter in the ongoing narrative of 2 creators grappling with a world that keeps surprising them. And the show had the honesty to let that discomfort show. It didn't pretend that everything was fine. It didn't pretend that the Garrison as Trump storyline was working perfectly. It just kept going, doing its best, acknowledging through its own unevenness that some things are harder to laugh at than others. It was a humbling moment, and Parker and Stone learned from it. In subsequent seasons, they pulled back from full serialization. They found a middle ground, maintaining some continuity between episodes while also allowing for standalone stories that could respond to current events in real time. It was the show adapting, evolving, learning from its mistakes, which is, when you think about it, exactly what the show had always done. And I think it's worth spending a moment on Gerald Broflovsky during this period, because his role in Season 20 was one of the most surprising and revealing character developments in the show's history. Gerald, Kyle's father, had always been presented as a responsible, somewhat boring suburban dad. He was a lawyer. He was community-minded. He was, by South Park standards, one of the good guys. And then Season 20 revealed that he was Skankhunt 42, that this respectable, educated, seemingly decent man had been spending his nights anonymously trolling people on the internet, posting vicious, hurtful content for no reason other than the pleasure of causing pain. It was a brilliant creative decision, because it forced the audience to confront the fact that internet trolling isn't just done by basement-dwelling losers. It's done by normal people, successful people, people who are kind to your face and cruel behind the anonymity of a screen. Gerald's trolling wasn't motivated by ideology or revenge. It was motivated by boredom, by the same suburban ennui that drives Randy's obsessions. Gerald was bored with his perfect life, and trolling gave him a thrill, an excitement, a sense of power that his day job couldn't provide. This was uncomfortably real, and it connected to the show's broader argument about human nature. South Park has always maintained that people are capable of terrible things, not because they're evil, but because they're bored, or scared, or lonely, or desperate for attention. Gerald's trolling was just the latest expression of this thesis. And the fact that it was Kyle's father doing it, that it was the parent of the show's moral center, made it even more devastating. If Kyle's own dad could be a monster in secret, then what hope was there for anyone? The Gerald subplot also drove a wedge between the boys and the girls, with the girls assuming one of the boys was responsible for the trolling and the resulting gender conflict tearing the school apart. This reflected the real-world polarization of 2016, where every issue became a battle between groups, where trust collapsed, where the possibility of good faith disagreement seemed to disappear. The show used the school as a microcosm of the country, showing how suspicion and accusation could destroy a community from within. And then there was the Memberberries arc, which ran through the entire season. These tiny, sentient fruits that spoke in nostalgic phrases. Remember the old days. Remember when things were simple. Remember Star Wars were one of the most creative satirical devices the show had ever invented. They were cute, they were harmless looking, and they were insidious. Because their nostalgia wasn't innocent. It started with Remember Chewbacca and gradually escalated to remember when there weren't so many immigrants and remember feeling safe, revealing the dark underbelly of collective nostalgia. The desire to return to a simpler time was, the show argued, inseparable from the desire to return to a less inclusive time. Nostalgia and regression were the same impulse in different clothes. The Memberberries also served as a meta-commentary on the show's own relationship with its past. South Park's audience was itself nostalgic for earlier seasons, for the shock comedy of the late 90s, for the simpler time when the show was just 4 kids swearing. And the show was saying, be careful with that nostalgia. Be careful with the desire to go back, because going back means losing everything we've gained. It was the show warning its own fans not to romanticize its origins, not to let the memory of what the show was interfere with their appreciation of what the show had become. Season 21, which aired in 2017, represented a deliberate recalibration. Parker and Stone had learned the lessons of the previous season. The show maintained some serialized elements, but returned to a primarily episodic format. The premiere, White People Renovating Houses, tackled the aftermath of the 2016 election and the anxieties of white working-class Americans. It was topical, but not trapped in a season-long arc. It could comment on the moment without being held hostage by it. And seasons 21 through 23 saw the show finding a new equilibrium. It was still political. It was still sharp. But it was also more reflective. More willing to sit with complexity rather than resolve it. The season 21 episode Put It Down, about North Korean nuclear threats and the anxiety of living in a world where catastrophe feels imminent, was surprisingly tender. Tweek and Craig, who had been paired as a couple in an earlier season as a joke about yaoi fan art, had their relationship treated with genuine warmth. The joke had become real, and the show honored that. Season 22, which aired in 2018, brought what might be the show's most significant act of self-correction. The two-part episode, Time to Get Cereal and Nobody Got Cereal, brought back Man Bear Pig. And this time, Man Bear Pig was real. The creature that the show had invented to mock Al Gore's climate warnings was now depicted as a genuine, deadly threat that the characters had spent years ignoring because it was easier to pretend the problem didn't exist. The show apologized to Al Gore. Directly. Explicitly. It admitted it had been wrong. And it used the man-bear-pig metaphor to argue that climate change was real, was dangerous, and had been ignored for too long because the people in power had made a deal with the devil, literally in the show's mythology, to maintain their comfortable lives. This was extraordinary. How many television shows have the courage to go back and say, "We were wrong about this, and we want to make it right"? How many artists are willing to use their own earlier work as evidence of the complacency they're now criticizing? It was a moment of genuine intellectual honesty. And it landed with enormous force, precisely because the show had built enough credibility over 2 decades to make the self-correction meaningful. The late teens and early 20s of South Park's run brought another major shift, and it centered on a character who had been quietly growing in importance for years. Randy Marsh, Stan's dad. The man who had started as a background character and gradually, almost accidentally, become one of the show's leads. In season 22, which aired in 2018, Randy did something drastic. He moved his family out of South Park and onto a cannabis farm that he named Tegrity Farms. This became the defining arc of the next several seasons. Randy growing weed, Randy selling weed, Randy becoming increasingly obsessed with his farm while his family grew more and more estranged. It was a storyline that divided the fan base. Some viewers loved seeing Randy in the spotlight. Others felt it came at the expense of the boys, who were increasingly pushed to the margins of their own show. And I think both reactions are valid, because the Tegrity Farms era represents a genuine tension within the show. Parker and Stone, now in their late 40s and early 50s, identified more with Randy than with the boys. The stories they wanted to tell were about middle-aged frustration, midlife crisis, the search for meaning in a world that seems increasingly insane. And Randy, with his impulsiveness and his need for validation and his stubborn refusal to admit he's wrong, was the perfect vehicle for those stories. The Tegrity Farms concept was quintessentially Randy. Impulsive, overcommitted, doomed to failure, and yet pursued with absolute conviction. Randy didn't just grow weed. He became a weed evangelist. He believed, with the same fervor he'd brought to every previous obsession, that cannabis farming was his destiny. That it gave him integrity, a sense of purpose. And the joke, of course, was that it didn't. His family was miserable. His weed was terrible. His business decisions were catastrophic. But he couldn't see it. Because Randy never sees it. That's his defining characteristic. The inability to recognize when he's wrong. The absolute confidence in his latest terrible idea. And Sharon, through all of this, was the voice of sanity. She didn't want to move to the farm. She didn't want to give up their comfortable suburban life. She could see, clearly and immediately, that Tegrity Farms was a disaster. But she went along with it. Because that's what Sharon does. That's what she's always done. She endures Randy's madness because she loves him, or because she's given up fighting him, or because the alternative, leaving, seems worse than staying. And the show, to its credit, treated Sharon's frustration with genuine respect. She wasn't a nag. She wasn't a killjoy. She was a reasonable person, trapped in an unreasonable situation. And the pathos of her situation, the quiet desperation of a woman watching her husband destroy their lives with the best of intentions, gave the Tegrity Farms arc an emotional weight that pure comedy couldn't have achieved. But the shift came at a cost. The boys, who had been the heart of the show for 2 decades, became supporting characters in their own story. And the dynamic that had driven the show for so long, 4 friends navigating a world they didn't understand, was replaced by a different dynamic. An adult man navigating a world he understood all too well. The Tegrity Farms arc finally wound down around season 27, when Randy abandoned the farm and returned to his original career in geology. But by then, it had left its mark. The show had demonstrated that it could center on different characters, tell different kinds of stories, and still be recognizably South Park. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing depends on what you want from the show. But it was, undeniably, an evolution. And I want to say something about Cartman during the Tegrity Farms era, because his arc during this period is one of the most interesting in the show's history. As Randy became more central, Cartman was freed from his usual role as the primary antagonist. And in that freedom, something strange happened. Cartman started to show moments of genuine vulnerability. Not many, not often, but enough to suggest that beneath the decades of manipulation and cruelty, there might be something human. The season 21 episode Moss Piglets, for instance, showed Cartman and Heidi Turner in a relationship that the show treated with surprising nuance. Cartman was, as always, manipulative. But there were moments where his need for connection, his fear of being alone, his desperate clinging to a relationship he didn't deserve, felt real. And the eventual dissolution of the Cartman-Heidi relationship, which played out across multiple episodes, was handled with a level of emotional sophistication that would have been unthinkable in earlier seasons. And then there was the season 22 episode, The Problem with Apu, which used a Mr. Hanky storyline as a parallel for the Me Too movement and cancel culture. The episode was divisive. Some felt it was trivializing a serious issue. Others felt it was making a valid point about the complexities of accountability and redemption. But regardless of where you fell on that debate, the episode demonstrated that South Park was still willing to wade into the most contentious cultural conversations, still willing to risk the backlash, still willing to say the thing that nobody else would say. This willingness, this almost compulsive need to provoke, is both the show's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It's the reason the show has remained relevant for 30 years. And it's the reason the show has occasionally been genuinely harmful, genuinely wrong, genuinely hurtful in ways that the creators later acknowledged. The Man-Bear-Pig correction was the most visible example of this acknowledgement. But there have been others. Moments where the show looked back at its own history with something like regret. Not enough to change course entirely, but enough to show that the creators are aware of their responsibility, that they take it seriously, that they understand that a show watched by millions of people has power, and that power comes with obligations. The Tegrity Farms era also saw the show engaging with the streaming wars, with social media culture, with the gig economy, with school shootings, in the devastating season, 22-episode Dead Kids, where Stan's mom is the only person who reacts emotionally to a school shooting, while everyone else treats it as routine. And with the general sense that American life had become so saturated with crises that people had stopped being able to feel them. And I should mention that alongside the Tegrity Farms storyline, these seasons continued to produce individual episodes of remarkable quality. The season 23 episode Basic Cable, which explored the decline of traditional cable television in the face of streaming services, featured the boys navigating a landscape where their parents' old media habits were becoming obsolete. It was a commentary on the same industry that had sustained South Park for 2 decades, and there was a poignant self-awareness in the show's willingness to critique the ecosystem that had made it possible. Season 22's Buddha Box, about the way smartphones had become addictive pacifiers for anxiety, showed Cartman hiding inside a cardboard box with only his phone for company, refusing to engage with the outside world. It was a simple visual metaphor, but it captured something real about the way technology was reshaping human connection. And the episode had a quiet ending, where Cartman finally emerged from his box. Not because he'd learned a lesson, but because the battery on his phone died. The satire wasn't about willpower or self-improvement. It was about dependence. About the fact that many of us don't choose to disconnect. We simply run out of charge. And the distinction between those two things, choosing to engage with the world versus being forced to by circumstance, says something uncomfortable about where we are as a society. And it connected to the show's long-running concern with isolation, with the barriers that people build between themselves and the world, with the ways we use entertainment and distraction to avoid confronting the things that scare us. That last point is worth dwelling on, because I think it's the key to understanding the show's tone during this period. South Park in its 20s, seasons 20 through 25 or so, was a show about numbness, about what happens when the outrage machine runs so constantly that people simply stop feeling. Dead Kids captured this perfectly. A school shooting happens. Sharon is horrified. Nobody else reacts. And the show's point isn't that school shootings aren't horrifying. It's that the constant exposure to horror has deadened people's capacity to respond to it. It's a critique not of the audience's morality, but of the culture that has eroded their ability to feel. And this connects to the broader arc of the show's evolution. In the late 90s, South Park was designed to shock, to make people feel something intense, even if that something was disgust or outrage. But by the late 2000s, the show was operating in a culture that had become resistant to shock, where everything was outrageous and nothing was surprising. And the show had to find new ways to break through. Sometimes it succeeded, sometimes it didn't. But the attempt itself, the ongoing effort to make people feel something real in a world that increasingly discouraged feeling, was admirable. Season 23, which aired in 2019, was the final pre-pandemic season. It featured Banned in China, an episode about American entertainment censoring itself to maintain access to the Chinese market. The episode was so pointed in its criticism that it was reportedly banned in China, which only proved the show's point. And it featured the season finale, Christmas Snow, which wrapped up several character arcs and featured the return of Santa Claus as a character, connecting back to the show's very origins in the spirit of Christmas short. It was a fitting bookend for the pre-pandemic era. A show that had begun with Jesus fighting Santa Claus in the snow ended its 23rd season with Santa Claus back in the snow. The circle closed. And then everything changed. But before we get to the pandemic, let me say something about what the show meant to people during this 23-season pre-COVID run, because the numbers alone are staggering. At its peak, South Park drew over 7 million viewers per episode. The movie grossed $83 million worldwide. The merchandise empire, the t-shirts, and the video games, and the catchphrases that entered the English language generated hundreds of millions more. But the numbers don't capture what the show meant on a personal level. To the teenagers who watched it in secret because their parents had forbidden it. To the college students who bonded over it in dorm rooms. To the adults who realized, rewatching it years later, that it was smarter than they'd given it credit for. South Park was, for an entire generation, the show that said the things you weren't supposed to say. The show that acknowledged the absurdity of the world without pretending it could fix it. The show that made you feel less alone in your cynicism, less crazy in your confusion, less isolated in your suspicion that the people in charge didn't actually know what they were doing. It was a companion, a trusted voice, a friend who was rude and crude and occasionally wrong, but who never, ever lied to you. And that relationship between show and audience, built over 23 years of weekly episodes and shared cultural moments, was the foundation on which everything that came next would be built. Before we move to the pandemic, though, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something about the show's journey from Season 1 to Season 23. 23 seasons, over 300 episodes, 22 years of continuous production, and in that time, the show had been many things: a shock comedy, a political satire, a cultural commentary, a character study, an experiment in serialization, a meditation on growing up, a document of American life. It had been all of these things, sometimes in the same episode, and it had done them all with a consistency and a commitment that was unlike anything else on television. And the remarkable thing is that it never felt like the show was trying to be all of these things. It didn't have a mission statement. It didn't have a grand artistic vision. It was just two guys in a room, trying to make each other laugh, trying to say something true about the world they lived in, and doing it every 6 days for over 2 decades. The depth emerged from the effort. The meaning emerged from the consistency. The art emerged from the work. There's a lesson in that, I think, about the power of sustained effort, about what happens when you show up, week after week, year after year, and try your best, even when you're tired, even when you're uninspired, even when you'd rather be doing anything else. Something accumulates, something builds, and eventually, the accumulation becomes greater than the sum of its parts. It becomes a legacy. It becomes a story worth telling. The kind of story we're telling tonight. And then came COVID, both in the real world and in South Park. Because of course it did. The pandemic hit in early 2020, and for a while, nobody knew how to respond. The entertainment industry shut down. Production halted on almost every television show. Late-night hosts filmed from their basements. Movies were delayed. Concerts were canceled. The entire cultural apparatus of American life ground to a halt. But South Park, characteristically, found a way. The show's production model, which had always seemed insane, turned out to be perfectly suited to pandemic conditions. A small team, a fast turnaround, a digital production pipeline that didn't require large gatherings. While other shows struggled to adapt, South Park pivoted almost seamlessly, and it responded the way it always had, by turning the crisis into comedy. The show produced a series of specials, beginning with the pandemic special in September 2020, that addressed the pandemic directly. The boys wore masks. The town went into lockdown. Randy, naturally, was somehow responsible for the virus, having contracted it from an ill-advised encounter with a pangolin during a trip to China. It was absurd. It was offensive. It was also, somehow, exactly what a lot of people needed. A way to laugh at the thing that was scaring them. The Vaccination Special, South Park Q Vaccination Special, aired in March 2021 and dealt with the distribution of vaccines and the conspiracy theories that surrounded them. It featured QAnon as a literal plot device, with the conspiracy theory infiltrating South Park's PTA. And it featured the death of Ms. Nelson, a teacher, which was treated not as a gag, but as a genuine loss. A quiet, serious acknowledgement that the pandemic was real and that real people were dying. The Vaccination Special also featured the return of Mr. Garrison from his stint as president, now disgraced and unwelcome in a town that blamed him for the pandemic response. His attempt to reintegrate into society, to go back to being just a teacher, reflected the broader American struggle to return to normalcy after years of political turmoil. How do you go back to normal when normal has been so thoroughly destroyed? The show also produced the Streaming Wars specials, which satirized the competition between streaming platforms and the water wars that climate change was increasingly making real. These specials featured Randy prominently, as always, and explored themes of scarcity, competition, and the way capitalism turns every resource into a commodity. They weren't the show's strongest work, but they demonstrated the continued viability of the longer format and the show's ongoing willingness to engage with current events. There was also the Worldwide Privacy Tour special, which satirized Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's post-royal media presence, and the Joining the Panderverse special, which took aim at Disney's diversity casting and the multiverse trend in superhero films. Each special demonstrated the flexibility of the longer format. The hour-long runtime allowed for more complex storytelling, more developed themes, and more emotional range than a standard episode could support. But the most remarkable thing the show did during the pandemic era wasn't a comedy special. It was the post-COVID movies. South Park, Post-COVID, which premiered on Paramount Plus on November 25th, 2021, and its sequel, The Return of COVID, which came out on December 16th, 2021, depicted the boys as adults, 40 years in the future. And the vision of the future was both funny and genuinely bleak. Stan was alone, living with a smart speaker as his only companion, working as an online whiskey consultant. Kyle was the school guidance counselor at South Park Elementary, still in the town, still unable to leave. Cartman had converted to Judaism, married, and become a rabbi with a family. Kenny was dead. Actually, permanently dead. Tweek and Craig were still together as a couple, a relationship that had started as a joke and survived into adulthood. Jimmy Valmer had become a late-night talk show host. Token Black was in law enforcement. And the boys, who had once been inseparable, hadn't spoken in decades. The world of the future was both recognizable and alien. Technology had advanced, but human nature hadn't. People were still petty, still scared, still lonely, still looking for meaning in a world that didn't seem to have any. The pandemic had ended, sort of, but its effects lingered in ways that no one had predicted. The specials argued, with a quiet devastation, that the real damage of the pandemic wasn't physical. It was social. It was the friendships that didn't survive the isolation. The connections that withered when people stopped seeing each other face to face. The trust that evaporated when the world became too scary to navigate together. The casting of the adult versions was itself a creative statement. By depicting the boys as recognizable but transformed adults, the show was saying something about the relationship between childhood and adulthood, about how the seeds of who we become are planted in the people we are at 8 years old. Adult Stan's alcoholism was the logical endpoint of the boy who saw everything as crap in You're Getting Old. Adult Kyle's inability to leave South Park was the logical endpoint of the boy who felt responsible for everyone's moral welfare. Adult Cartman's conversion to Judaism was either the ultimate redemption or the ultimate manipulation, and the ambiguity was the logical endpoint of a character who had always existed between humanity and monstrosity. And Kenny's death was the logical endpoint of a boy who had been dying his entire life. It was the first time the show had seriously explored what would happen to these characters if they were allowed to age, and the answer was sobering. Without the reset button, without the eternal youth that kept them in 4th grade, the boys' friendship couldn't survive the accumulated weight of real life. They grew apart. They became strangers. The bond that had seemed unbreakable when they were 8 turned out to be fragile when they were 48. But here's what redeemed it. Kenny. Even in death, Kenny was the one trying to bring them back together. His final project, his life's work, was a plan to fix the timeline, to change the past so that the boys' friendship would survive into adulthood. And the fact that it was Kenny, the character who had spent the entire series being overlooked and forgotten, who understood the value of their friendship most clearly, was deeply moving. Kenny, who remembered every death while nobody remembered his, understood loss better than anyone, and he used that understanding to fight for the one thing that mattered. And what makes these specials so important in the context of the show's overall story is that they represent the first time South Park seriously engaged with the concept of consequences. For 25 years, The show had operated on the premise that nothing had lasting effects. Characters died and came back. Relationships broke and reformed. The town was destroyed and rebuilt. The reset button was always there, ready to restore the status quo. But the post-COVID specials said, what if there's no reset button? What if actions have consequences? What if the choices these characters made as children actually shaped who they became as adults? And the answer was painful. Stan's isolation was the consequence of his cynicism. Kyle's inability to leave South Park was the consequence of his sense of obligation. Cartman's apparent transformation was either genuine growth or the ultimate long con manipulation, and we couldn't tell which was itself a consequence of how thoroughly he destroyed everyone's trust over the years. The fact that the show could generate this much emotional weight by simply removing the reset button tells you how much latent depth had accumulated beneath the surface. 25 years of apparently consequence-free storytelling had actually been building an enormous reservoir of unresolved emotional material. And the post-COVID specials tapped into that reservoir and let it flood. The post-COVID specials were part of a larger deal between South Park and Paramount Plus. In August 2021, Parker and Stone signed a deal reportedly worth $900 million to extend South Park through season 30 and produce 14 exclusive streaming movies. Later, in 2025, that deal was extended further, reportedly to $1.5 billion, guaranteeing the show through at least 2030 with 10 new episodes annually. It was an extraordinary commitment, both financial and creative, and it ensured that South Park, which had already lasted longer than anyone could have predicted, would continue for years to come. The additional Paramount Plus specials that followed explored different aspects of the South Park universe. Some were set in the present, some in the future, some in alternate timelines. They experimented with the longer format, running roughly an hour each rather than the standard 22 minutes. And they gave Parker and Stone a canvas for storytelling that the regular show's format didn't allow. They could build slower. They could go deeper. They could take the characters to places that a standard episode didn't have time for. Meanwhile, the regular show continued. Season 25 and 26 continued the tradition of mixing topical satire with character-driven stories. Season 26 featured the Dykenbau's Hot Dogs episode, which finally gave Butters a moment of genuine growth and self-assertion, standing up to Cartman after years of being his victim. It was a small moment in the show's vast history, but for fans who had watched Butters be exploited for over 2 decades, it was cathartic. And Season 27, which aired in 2025, brought the end of the Tegrity Farms era. Randy finally abandoned the cannabis farm and returned to his original career as a geologist. The arc that had dominated the show for nearly 5 seasons was over. And the show began to shift its focus back toward the boys, back toward the core dynamic that had driven it from the beginning. Whether this shift was in response to fan feedback or to Parker and Stone's own creative instincts, the result was a season that felt like a return to form, like the show was remembering what it was. And this brings us to the present, to where we are now, to season 27 and 28, and whatever comes next. And I think the most remarkable thing about South Park in its current era is that it's still trying, still experimenting, still taking risks. The show could have coasted. It could have settled into a comfortable formula and repeated itself for the rest of its run. But it hasn't. It keeps pushing. It keeps evolving. It keeps finding new things to say about a world that keeps giving it new things to say about. And there's something else about the current era that I think is worth noting. The show has entered its legacy phase. Not in the sense that it's winding down, but in the sense that it's now old enough to have a history. Old enough that there are fans who grew up with the show and are now introducing it to their own children. Old enough that references to early episodes are acts of nostalgia in themselves. Old enough that the show's relationship with its own past has become a theme in its own right. The member berries in Season 20 were the first explicit acknowledgement of this. But the show has continued to engage with the question of what it means to be a long-running cultural institution. How do you stay relevant without pandering? How do you honor your past without being trapped by it? How do you speak to a new generation while remaining true to the voice that defined you? These are questions that every long-running creative enterprise has to face. The Rolling Stones face them. The Simpsons face them. Saturday Night Live faces them. But South Park has faced them with a self-awareness that most of its peers lack. The show knows it's old. It knows that the cultural landscape has changed. And rather than pretending otherwise, it incorporates that awareness into its storytelling. The show's age isn't a weakness. It's a subject. The most recent seasons have seen the show grappling with artificial intelligence, with the rise of ChatGPT, and the implications of machines that can generate creative content. There's a bitter irony in the fact that a show made by two humans working under extreme time pressure is now commenting on a technology that could theoretically make that process obsolete. And knowing Parker and Stone, they're probably delighted by that irony, probably mining it for all it's worth. And I should note that through all these changes, through the Tegrity Farms era and the pandemic specials and the streaming deal and the shifting focus from boys to adults and back again, the show never lost its essential quality. That quality is hard to define precisely, but you know it when you see it. It's the combination of irreverence and sincerity, of crudeness and intelligence, of saying something that makes you laugh, and then realizing a few seconds later that it also made you think. Not every episode achieves this balance. Some lean too heavily toward the crude, some lean too heavily toward the preachy, but the best episodes, the ones that people remember and re-watch and talk about years later, all share that quality. That feeling that you've been entertained and challenged simultaneously. That you've been given a gift wrapped in a joke. The Deep Learning episode explored the idea of AI writing schoolwork and what that means for authenticity and effort. It was a topic that resonated with parents and students alike, and the show handled it with its characteristic blend of absurdity and insight. And there have been episodes about Ozempic and weight loss drugs, about the changing landscape of media consumption, about the way social media has fragmented shared cultural experiences. Each of these episodes connected to the show's larger project of documenting American life in real time. Each one was another entry in the longest-running diary of American culture that television has ever produced. And they've continued to grapple with the central question that has haunted the show since You're Getting Old. What do you do when the world stops making sense? When the things you believed in turn out to be wrong? When the people you trusted turn out to be flawed? When growing up means not gaining wisdom, but losing certainty? South Park has never offered a clean answer to this question. And I think that's the most honest thing about it. Because there is no clean answer. Life is messy. People are complicated. The world is absurd. And the best you can do is keep going. Keep showing up. Keep paying attention. Keep caring about the people around you, even when they drive you crazy, even when they let you down, even when they can't remember that you died last week. And I want to pause here and reflect on something, on the sheer improbability of what we've been describing. Because think about what South Park has survived. It has survived the culture wars of the 90s. It has survived 9/11 and the war on terror. It has survived the 2008 financial crisis. It has survived the rise of social media and the attention economy. It has survived the political polarization of the 2000s. It has survived a global pandemic. It has survived the departure of a core cast member. It has survived genuine death threats. It has survived its own creative crises, its own failures, its own moments of doubt and exhaustion. And through all of it, the show has remained essentially itself, crude and profound, offensive and compassionate, chaotic and structured. It has changed dramatically across every dimension of its existence, from its animation style to its narrative structure to its political perspective to its character dynamics. But its core identity has remained stable. And that stability, maintained across 3 decades of constant change, is the most remarkable thing about it. It's like a river. The water is always different. The current is always changing. But the riverbed, the channel through which the water flows, remains the same. South Park's riverbed is its commitment to honesty, to saying the thing that nobody else will say, to treating its audience as adults who can handle complexity and ambiguity and discomfort, to caring about its characters even when it's hurting them. That's what's remained constant. That's what makes South Park South Park. And the story isn't over. That's the thing. With the show contracted through at least 2030, with new episodes and specials and movies in production, the story of South Park is still being written. The characters are still in 4th grade. The town is still the same. The world is still changing around them. And Trey Parker and Matt Stone are still in the writer's room, still burning through 6-day production cycles, still trying to say something true about a world that gets stranger every day. What will the next chapter bring? I don't know. Nobody does. That's the nature of a show that responds to the world in real time. The next episode could be about anything. It could be about the latest political crisis. It could be about a technological breakthrough. It could be about something small and personal and human. Whatever it is, it will be made in 6 days. It will be crude and beautiful and offensive and sincere. It will add another layer to a structure that has been building for 30 years. And it will be watched by an audience that has grown up with the show, that has aged alongside its ageless characters, that has been changed by a show that never changes. That's the story of South Park. Not just the episodes and the seasons and the specials, but the meta story. The story of a show that was never supposed to last, that was made by people who were never supposed to become television legends, that was about characters who were never supposed to grow up. And yet here we are, almost 30 years later, and it's still going, still growing, still surprising us. And what I find most beautiful about that story is its improbability. Because South Park should have been a fad. It should have burned bright for a few seasons and then faded, like so many other provocative shows of the late 90s. Remember how many South Park imitators there were? Shows that thought the secret was just to be offensive, to say the thing you weren't supposed to say. And they all failed. They all disappeared. Because they misunderstood what made South Park work. South Park didn't work because it was offensive. It worked because it cared. And I don't mean that in some abstract, theoretical sense. I mean it literally. Watch the show closely enough, and you can see the care in every frame. In the way Parker voices Cartman, with manic energy one moment, and quiet vulnerability the next. In the way Stone crafts Kenny's muffled dialogue with full sentences that nobody will hear. In the way the animation team hides aliens in the background for viewers who might never find them. In the way the writers circle back to old storylines and characters. Not because the plot requires it, but because they remember them. Because they care about them. Because in some deep, probably irrational way, these fictional people matter to the people who created them. That's the secret ingredient. Not talent, although Parker and Stone are enormously talented. Not work ethic, although their 6-day production schedule is almost superhuman. Not longevity, although 30 years is an extraordinary run. The secret ingredient is care. The willingness to invest emotion in something that most people would dismiss as a crude cartoon. The refusal to phone it in. The insistence, even after 3 decades, on trying to make every episode mean something. It cared about its characters. It cared about its world. It cared about saying something true, even when the truth was ugly or uncomfortable or politically inconvenient. The offensiveness was never the point. It was just the medium through which the point was delivered. The crudeness was a Trojan horse, a way of getting past people's defenses, a way of making them laugh so hard that they accidentally absorbed a genuine insight about human nature, or politics, or morality, or the absurdity of existence. And this, ultimately, is what separates South Park from everything else. Not the humor, not the controversy, not the longevity, but the sincerity underneath the irony, the heart beneath the profanity, the care behind the carelessness. Every great episode of South Park works because it cares about something, about a character, about an issue, about the truth of human experience, and that care, communicated through the most unlikely medium imaginable, a crude animated comedy about foul-mouthed children, is what makes the show art. Not prestige art, not serious art, not the kind of art that wins awards and gets written up in academic journals, although South Park has done both, but real art, the kind that changes how you see the world, the kind that stays with you long after you've forgotten the specific jokes, the kind that 30 years later, still has new things to reveal to people who are willing to look. And the point, always, was that the world is complicated, people are flawed, and the only thing that makes any of it bearable is the people you go through it with. 4 boys, a small town, and the whole world, reflected in paper cutout form. That's the story. That's always been the story. From the spirit of Christmas, to the post-COVID specials, to whatever comes next. It's always been about the same thing. The struggle to make sense of a senseless world. The struggle to find meaning in chaos. The struggle to hold on to the people you love even as everything around you changes. And the fact that the story isn't over yet, that there are still seasons to come, still specials to produce, still episodes to create in 6 frantic days, means that we get to keep watching it unfold. We get to keep being surprised. We get to keep finding new things in a show that has been hiding things in plain sight for nearly 30 years. And there's one more thing I want to mention before we wrap up, and it's about the show's place in the broader landscape of American animation. Because South Park didn't just tell its own story, it changed the story of animated television itself. Before South Park, there was essentially one model for adult animation: The Simpsons. The Simpsons had proved that animated shows could appeal to adults. But The Simpsons, for all its brilliance, was fundamentally a family show. It was warm. It was accessible. It was designed to be watched by everyone from 8 to 80. South Park broke that model. It proved that animated shows could be genuinely adult. Not just in terms of content, though the content was certainly not for children, but in terms of ambition. South Park tackled subjects that no animated show had ever tackled. It engaged with current events at a speed that no other show could match. It used its medium not as a limitation, but as a liberation. Because it was animated, it could do anything. It could depict any scenario, no matter how outrageous. It could create any world, no matter how absurd. And it could do it in 6 days, at a fraction of the cost of live-action production. This opened the door for everything that came after. Family Guy, American Dad, Archer, Rick and Morty, BoJack Horseman, Big Mouth. All of these shows owe something to South Park. Not necessarily in terms of style or tone, but in terms of the basic proposition that animated shows for adults could be smart, could be complex, could be politically engaged, could be artistically ambitious. South Park didn't just tell a great story. It expanded the definition of what animated stories could be. I think about what it must be like for Parker and Stone to have created something that has lasted this long, to have lived with these characters for most of their adult lives, to have started as young men cutting up construction paper and to now be elder statesmen of American comedy. The world they created in their 20s has followed them into their 50s, and they've carried it faithfully, even when it was exhausting, even when they wanted to move on, even when the 6-day production schedule felt like a prison rather than a playground. There's a scene in the 6 Days to Air documentary where Trey Parker is sitting at his desk at 3 in the morning, exhausted, trying to finish an episode that has to air in less than 24 hours. And he looks at the camera and says something to the effect of, "I hate it. I hate every second of it." And then he goes back to work. Because the deadline doesn't care how he feels. The show doesn't care how he feels. The audience is waiting, and he owes them something, so he gives it to them. That's dedication. That's the kind of commitment that you can't fake and you can't sustain without genuinely caring about what you're doing. And it's the reason the show has lasted as long as it has. Because even when it's hard, even when it's miserable, even when every instinct says to stop, Parker and Stone keep going. They keep making it. They keep showing up, just like their characters. Just like four boys in a small Colorado town who face the end of the world every week and are back at the bus stop the next morning. That's the entire story of South Park. Not the plot, not the episodes, not the seasons, but the real story, the human one. Two friends who made something together and never stopped, who survived success and controversy and creative exhaustion and personal upheaval and the relentless march of time, who built a world out of paper and somehow made it last longer than most things built of stone. And maybe the most remarkable thing about that story is that it continues, right now. As you listen to this, somewhere, probably in the South Park Studios offices in Los Angeles, the next episode is being written, or the next special, or the next movie. And it will be made in 6 days. And it will be crude and profound and offensive and heartfelt and everything else that South Park has always been. And it will be another layer added to a structure that has been building for 30 years. And there's something poetic about that continuity. About the fact that the same two people who cut up construction paper in a college dorm room in 1992 are still making this show in 2026. That's 34 years of collaboration. 34 years of shared creative vision. Parker and Stone's partnership is one of the longest and most productive in entertainment history. And the show they've made together is the physical record of that partnership. Every episode is a document of their creative relationship at that particular moment. The early episodes capture the explosive energy of two young men discovering their powers. The middle seasons capture the confidence and ambition of their maturity. The recent seasons capture the wisdom and fatigue of their later years. And when you watch the show chronologically, as we've been doing tonight, what you're really watching is two friendships. The friendship between Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny on screen, and the friendship between Trey Parker and Matt Stone behind the screen. Both friendships have survived decades. Both have been tested by success and failure, and the relentless passage of time. And both, somehow, endure. They endure because the people involved, fictional and real, need each other. They complete each other. They bring out the best and worst in each other. And they can't imagine their lives without each other. That's the entire story. That's what it all comes down to. Two friendships, one real and one imaginary, that have lasted 30 years and counting. Everything else, the satire, the controversy, the cultural commentary, the mythology, all of it is built on that foundation. And as long as that foundation holds, the show will continue. The story will continue. The conversation between creators and audience, between past and present, between four boys and the world they inhabit, will go on. And you'll watch it, and you'll laugh. And maybe you'll notice something you haven't noticed before. A background detail, a callback, a hidden alien. And you'll realize, once again, that there's more to this show than meets the eye. That there always has been. And that there always will be. And maybe the best way to end this story is not with a conclusion, but with a continuation. Because that's what South Park is. A continuation. A sentence that started in 1992 and hasn't reached its period yet. A conversation that keeps going because the world keeps giving it new things to talk about. A friendship, both on screen and behind the scenes, that has survived everything that time and fate and human fallibility could throw at it. The story of South Park is the story of America. Not the whole story, not even the most important parts, But the parts that are hardest to tell in any other way, the contradictions, the hypocrisies, the moments of unexpected beauty, the moments of inexplicable cruelty, the way we keep going even when we don't know why, the way we keep laughing even when we know we shouldn't, the way we keep caring about each other even when we pretend we don't. 4 boys, a small town, and 30 years of trying to make sense of it all. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this one. I really do. It was a long journey tonight, from 1992 to the present, and I appreciate you staying with me through all of it. Whether you're still awake or whether you drifted off somewhere around season 12, I'm glad you were here. Take care of yourselves, wherever you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.